Will Caden Sterns start next to Justin Simmons this upcoming season, or should the Broncos take a look at free agent options in the offseason? You'll get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day in your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube, you can get us free everywhere every single day. Make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content coverage, and more. If you're watching on YouTube, please do us a favor, hit that like button, comment for the algorithm, and engage with other members in Broncos Country as well on today's episode of the show. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, the carousel continues ahead of the start of the NFL free agency period. We're just days away from the legal tampering, legal negotiating period, though we know a lot of those conversations happened at the NFL Scouting Combine. We're going to take a look at the safety position today, and we're going to maybe pose the question why the Broncos should look at safety in free agency, and maybe why they shouldn't. And there's a multitude of angles we can approach this from. I can't wait to break it down with you and everybody in Broncos Country.
Can't wait, Cody. Always love talking at this time of year. This is my favorite time of year, as you well know, when we get to build the roster, to talk about hypotheticals, talk about different scenarios and situations. The safety position is really one of those positions I think is kind of being slept on in Broncos Country right now. Maybe just a little bit like the tight end position, where we kind of assume a player who struggled with injuries last year may be ready to step into a full-time starting role, but there are some inherent risks, obviously, that come along with that. But first and foremost, we got to talk about last year's starter, the number one safety on this year's free agent market in terms of snaps played in 2022. Believe it or not, Kareem Jackson, more snaps than any other free agent safety out there this offseason, Cody. And Kareem Jackson, he's obviously been with the Denver Broncos since 2019. Remember when he signed? He was a corner with the Houston Texans back in the day, former first-round pick out of Alabama, and then obviously had a very successful NFL career playing corner, nickel. He did obviously transition to safety in Denver under Vic Fangio, and he's been relatively successful there, I would say. I mean, not to sell him short, he's been a successful player making that transition to safety. So Kareem Jackson hitting free agency might be the number one reason why you look to other free agents. He's getting a little bit up there in age. Maybe you go look for somebody a little bit younger.
And I think, you make some interesting points too, because we look at safety and we look at that notion that Kareem played 100% of the snaps last year. And I know this for certainty too. Kareem was banged up last year, and he had a multitude of injuries that were impacting him, but he still made it every single week, even though, there were times where he didn't practice during the week. At this point of his career, and we all know he said in the offseason, he wants to play at least one or two more seasons. If you're the Broncos, I mean, do you kind of let him finish out maybe this final year potentially in Denver? I think we have to have the conversation, though. If Kareem Jackson were to come back in Denver, is he the starter next to Justin Simmons? Do you foresee him in that role, especially with a guy like Caden Sterns, who we saw start when Justin Simmons was out on injured reserve? And, man, I tell you what, he played fantastic when Simmons was out. And the idea and the notion, the conversation right now around Broncos Country and the internal belief in the organization is that Justin Simmons is going to have Caden Sterns starting next to him this upcoming season, which I like that. I'm excited. I hope we get to see that. But this is why we talk about, free agency and potential options. Caden Sterns is coming off of reconstructive hip surgery. He did have an operation last season. It was something that he was dealing with even in training camp. And we all know that hips can be very, very tricky because scar tissue in the hip area is kind of a pain in the rear end, if you know what I mean. And if anybody's ever had a hip operation, they know exactly what I'm talking about here. You have to ask yourself, can you bank on the fact that Caden Sterns will be healthy this season with Justin Simmons? I think when healthy, and when we've seen him, he's an impact player. He's a guy that's always around the football. He's generating takeaways. This is who he is. He's risen for a guy who's drafted in the 5th round. But because of the injury, I think it's fair we have to ask this question.
I think it is a very fair question, Cody, especially when we're talking about, look, all these things are tied together, right? If you let Draymond Jones walk in free agency, where are you going to need to be a lot better? In the secondary, right? So you obviously are taking a huge risk with somebody that's coming off an injury, somebody who, dating back to his days at Texas, remember that was a big area of struggle. That's a big reason why he fell to the 5th round of that 2021 NFL draft, is injuries and inconsistency at Texas kind of limiting his ability to produce. So really with Broncos country, it's interesting, Cody. George Paton gets scolded a lot for signing free agents with injury problems. And yet it seems like almost the borderline consensus among Broncos country is to put these more injury prone players, for lack of a better term, into the starting lineup and really rely on them to play significant roles. And I understand the situation and the circumstances, but are you going to leave free agency this year looking at this group of free agent safeties, which, as we're going to touch on here in a little bit, it's pretty good? Are you going to rely on these guys who have struggled with injuries in the past carrying that room and passing on an opportunity to upgrade that position when you had the chance in free agency? Just like we've talked about in years past, I mean, I think that this is a situation where the Broncos really do. You wish that the Broncos had the Bears cap space, right? This $100 million in cap space. They can go do whatever they want. Don't have to really make any adjustments. Just rebuild the roster however you see fit. The reality is they do have a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, you got to work within the confines of the cap. I'll be fascinated to see what decisions they make at this position. Maybe bringing back Kareem Jackson, who once played for Vance Joseph in Houston. Maybe that is the kind of raising the floor of the room, as we talked about on yesterday's show with the tight end position.
I forgot about that tie too with Vance. I mean, it could make sense. You do want a veteran guy in that locker room, though. You do have Justin Simmons. You have a solidified leader in Patrick Surtain. You have guys like Josie Jewell, Alex Singleton, if he were to come back. Denver doesn't lack leaders on the defensive side of the ball, which is good. And I think Caden Sterns can even be that. Now, in terms of some connections here, we'll highlight before we maybe even pose the question why the Broncos should not look at free agent options. We'll look at connections. Adrian Amos, we know him. He's been a playmaker in the NFL before, former ties to Christian Parker. Von Bell, former ties to Sean Payton, Nasir Adderley. Some ties there with Michael Wilhoit, the outside linebacker coach for Denver. And then you have John Johnson, who is a former Boston College teammate of Justin Simmons, who is expected to be available. And I know that's already been thrown out there about the Boston College connection. Can you reunite these two? We'll see if that's on the table here, but we'll see what the Broncos decide to do. I think we'll get some clarity next week or even in 2 weeks' time. It could take time to figure out what they're going to do at safety, particularly with the Kareem Jackson side of things. But one thing is for certain, we'll have you covered here every step of the way here, Locked on Broncos every single day. And on today's episode of the show, we're going to throw out the question, why should the Broncos not take a look at free agent options at the safety position? You'll get that on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers, they get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000, and that's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and it's super easy to use and to navigate. And then you can bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to props like three-pointers drained in a game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets at a chance for a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss a chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. When it pertains to the safety position in free agency, why should the Broncos not take a look at free agent options this upcoming offseason? Thank you so much for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre, let's throw it here. Let's open up the floor. We talked about why the Broncos should look at free agent options considering some players' injury history. You could potentially lose a veteran guy like Kareem Jackson, who you have re-signed in back-to-back years on one-year deals. Is that in the cards for Denver here once again? It's always a possibility. But I also think that those things aside, Denver has, I think, a lot of ground, and you can make a case maybe why they shouldn't look at free agent options and look at the depth that they already have. I'm curious your thoughts on this and what that depth currently is, because it's Justin Simmons, it's Caden Sterns, it's PJ Locke's going to be restricted. I imagine he might be back. We'll play that game here in a little bit. De'Aaron Turner-Yell, and I think that's it. I think that's all you have right now. You have to find a way to take some chances on some of these young guys that you've invested draft capital in, though.
Yeah, do you take those chances? They've also got Devin Key, a reserve future player. I guess you never count those dart throws out as well. But really what you mentioned, those are the key guys right now. Delarian Turner-Yale, you drafted him last year in the 5th round, and he really kind of possesses some of those qualities that we watched him coming out. Somebody that, you watch him at Oklahoma and you feel like, man, I know this has been a popular term thrown out over the last few years, but the Kareem Jackson replacement type of, attitude on the field and the way that he attacks the line of scrimmage and things like that. So maybe you do bank on some of these young guys, and that's why you pass on the free agent class, because you want to see Caden Sterns be able to take a step into a full-time role. If you go out and sign a John Johnson or a Von Bell or an Adrian Amos, you're not necessarily going to be playing Caden Sterns 1,000 snaps next season, right? And maybe you want to see him try to get to that point. So I think that's maybe where George Paton, we know he loves to grow his players in-house. We know that for a fact. He said that when he was initially hired. I think the proof is in the pudding. A lot of his draft picks have started games for the Denver Broncos. So there's really a philosophical element to all this that I think has to be considered. Like the George Paton doesn't seem like he always wants to go out and just kill these things with fire in free agency. He might go, a lower tier signing or somebody that you're maybe debating over the course of the offseason. Could this guy play over Caden Sterns? Would he even play over PJ Locke? So maybe we're looking more towards some type of really lower tier free agent signing, maybe somebody who's not even been a full-time starter before themselves, who really is in a position to compete. I think that's one of the primary reasons why you do it, is because you really want to see these young guys hit the field.
Well, and I think we've seen these guys produce, right? We've talked about Caden Sterns. Heck, even PJ Locke. Defensively, look, he led the team in special teams tackles, but defensively, he came up big in some big moments last year. I mean, how can we forget San Francisco? He dislodged the ball from Jeff Wilson. Kareem Jackson scooped it up. So, I mean, you have two safeties making a play to win a game for Denver, which could make things a little bit more appealing to kind of keep that room and that unit intact. I don't think it's broken, right? So we always use the mantra, if it's not broken, don't fix it. You have to see, in my opinion, what you have with Caden Sterns. You have to see what you have with PJ Locke. And I think that for those guys, with Justin Simmons leading that room, I think you're in a really good position with a guy like DTY as well. And if you're going to invest, like I said, that capital in these guys, which George Paton has invested that capital in a guy like Caden Sterns. He did invest it in Jamar Johnson at one point, who's no longer on the team, who didn't make it. Like, the expectation was that maybe Jamar Johnson was going to be the guy before Caden Sterns was, and Caden Sterns has certainly made the most of his opportunities when on the field. To my understanding, Sterns is on track for the season, and he's going through the whole process, continuing to rehab from the hip surgery. I think him getting that surgery in season helped him out a little bit, and maybe you could have made an argument. If he would have had it sooner, maybe he would have, I don't know. Like, it's been something that's been bothering him for a while. Maybe you would have had more of a ceiling with him in a sense. I think that his production in the first couple of games, the 3 or 4 games that he actually started after that week 5 game against the Colts really kind of being sidelined, I tell you what, man, he's impressive. He's impressive. He's smart. He understands how to read a quarterback. And there was that one play, one of those interceptions he had against Matt Ryan where, he's playing in that dime role. He's kind of cheating up. I don't know if he was playing robber. I have to go back and look at the play, but he's keying Matt Ryan's eyes the whole time, and he understands. He's also looking to his right, and he sees that, hey, there's a crosser coming this way. I'm gonna sit in front of this, and bam, he tested him twice and picked him off twice, and I think that's what Denver needs. They need guys who are smart, high IQ football players. Sterns is that. You have to roll with that. Now, to your point, if you believe that there's another safety out there, and maybe like with Caden Sterns and his injury history, maybe you don't want him to play 100% of the snaps. Maybe you want to split it up with him and another guy. I don't know how they'll impact your continuity from a schematic standpoint, though, because you want usually your same guys, your best players on the field. If you're constantly rotating guys, I'm not sure how much value you're actually going to get out of them in the long run. So you have to invest in that. But I want to get your thoughts on DTY. Obviously, a key special teams player. Had a couple of plays last season, a fumble recovery, and we didn't get to see too much of him on the defensive side of the ball. I imagine there could be a chance we see a little bit more of DTY this season defensively, and maybe with the new defense coordinator in Vance Joseph, maybe he sees something that maybe we didn't see last year in him.
Yeah, the college scouting department did their thing with DTY, getting him into the building as of last year's NFL draft. Now the pro scouting department really has to do their thing, Cody, in terms of maybe selling this new coaching staff. As we know, Sean Payton, they talked about at the NFL scouting combine. I can't remember the exact analogy he used, but essentially, oh yeah, that's right. He was talking about taking a dive into the roster, right? And he said that he hasn't really he hasn't put on the scuba gear, more of a snorkel look at the roster is kind of what he said. So as you get them into that deep dive scuba gear level analysis of the roster, your pro scouts have to be able to sell Sean Payton and this coaching staff now defensively led by Vance Joseph, and as well as Christian Parker, right? You kept Christian Parker. He's got to be one of the biggest advocates for these young guys. What's one of the primary reasons why you keep Christian Parker on your coaching roster? Number one to me, Cody, and you know this, as I always say, player development. Who's been better at developing young talent on this roster over the past handful of years than Christian Parker in the defensive backfield? I would argue nobody. And so therefore, you've got somebody that your college scouts believe in. You got somebody that you believed in enough to draft him in Delarian Turner-Yell. And you've also got a position coach that you believe you kept him around, one of two position coaches kept around by the previous regime. If those three factors aren't enough to maybe say, hey, we're going to push this guy up the depth chart a little bit this coming season, then I don't know what would do it, unless you're just absolutely blown away by somebody in this year's draft or free agency. My personal thought on that is that, hey, you go to the draft and you draft somebody to replace him on special teams a little bit, or somebody that could play special teams right away and give DTY that opportunity to take the next step. Maybe Caden Sterns drops back into the two deep, if that's what Vance Joseph is going to, if we're going to see him run some of the Fangio concepts, right? And then DTY can take over Caden Sterns' role in that dime package like you talked about. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but number one, if your college scouts believe in this kid, that's a big thing. He played special teams last year. He cut his teeth. That's huge. If your pro scouts can sell the new coaching staff on him, that's great. Christian Parker, great talent developer. Cody, to me, those all add up to maybe the Broncos kind of staying in-house at this position.
I'm not opposed to it. To be honest with you, my preference would be that they do stay with the in-house route. I mean, it doesn't hurt them. I mean, that's why you invested capital in Sterns and DTYs, because you believe they can eventually grow into something special. We already know Justin Simmons is going to be locked in for, a long, long time, barring anything unforeseen down the road. Denver, I think, is in a pretty good position at the safety spot right now. Now, if there's one or two injuries, it could change things, and knocking on wood, hopefully that's not the case this upcoming season. But one thing we are going to discuss is Broncos Country shared their thoughts with us on what the Broncos should do at the safety position. Should they make any moves in free agency, or should they stay put? We'll get to Broncos Country's responses on today's episode of the show. I wanted to tell you about the Locked On Podcast Network and what we have going on. If you go to LockedOnPodcast.com, in the top right-hand corner, there is a newsletter tab. And when you click on that newsletter tab, it'll pop up a menu. They'll ask you for your name. It'll ask you who your favorite teams are, and it'll allow you to sign up for a free NFL draft newsletter. On top of that, it'll also get to know your favorite teams on the NFL side of things, the NBA, NHL, college, MLB, and you get curated newsletters sent directly to you, so you stay in the loop with everything that's going on here at the Locked On Podcast Network with your favorite teams, your team, every day. Broncos Country chimed in on their thoughts on the safety position and whether or not the team should look at options in free agency or whether they should stay put. Thank you so much once again, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, in the YouTube comment section down below right now, make sure you interact and you share your thoughts on what the Broncos should do in free agency at the safety position. Interact with other members of Broncos Country as well. Sayre, I mean, we put it out there on the social media side of things. Fans, they chimed in with their thoughts, and I always like when they engage, because you could tell how passionate Broncos Country is with certain positions, certain players, and I think you get a wide variety of different answers. You get people who are like, yes, do this, and you get people who are vehemently against things. So I think we get a little bit of everything, and let's share some responses here. Let's start things off with our friend Gary Pickren, who sent us something on Twitter.
Gary, thanks for chiming in. I love it. He says Caden Sterns should be a starter. He's shown flashes on the field, and I believe if it wasn't for injury, he would have been moved to starter by end of last season. That's a really interesting thought there by Gary, because we did see a huge uptick. Obviously, the Justin Simmons injury played a factor in that, but we did see a huge uptick in Caden Sterns' snap count as compared to his rookie season. Remember when he was kind of just coming in there in spots. He did really grow into a different role this past season, and we saw him earning that playing time. So I think that's kind of one of the prevailing opinions, Cody. Obviously, I think another Twitter user and a listener of the show, Jake Dinwiddie, he kind of maybe agrees with what Gary is saying.
Yeah, he says, I feel like Sterns has more than proven he deserves a shot, and I think you and I, even, what was it? It was Fangio's last year. You and I were even saying, what was it, after the Baltimore game, that maybe Vic Fangio should move Kareem Jackson to that dime role and then put Caden Sterns at the back end. But, I mean, he was able to get, was it a sack on Lamar Jackson? I mean, he was able to generate takeaways, intercepted Dak Prescott in his rookie season. And then last year, I think, in the games that he played, put on some very damn good tape, which to me gave me confidence saying, okay, hey, this is the right guy to have. Like, he's a guy you want to build with Justin Simmons. And I think it's unfortunate we never really got to see Justin Simmons and Caden Sterns last year. I know we got to see Kareem and Caden, and Caden really, really excelled in that role. But this needs to be the year, in my opinion, we see Justin and Caden be the two primary safeties for this team. I mean, that's how I feel like they should, operate and maneuver. I hope the team feels the same way.
Well, and that's what Caden Staub, our good buddy, he says that as well. Roll with Sterns and Simmons while spending that money on the O-line. Remember, I said this before, and I think we would all agree that a lot of these decisions are tied together, right? You let Draymond Jones go. Maybe you put a little more focus on the safety position or the defensive backfield in general to really just upgrade that unit. But also, if you do that, that could affect how much you're able to spend on the offensive line. And with this ownership group and the cash they have on hand, I think that the mindset shift is going to soon come, Cody, where we'll see the Broncos are going to be able to be very, very flexible against the cap. Like, I'm not saying that you want to operate like this, but man, the New Orleans Saints, they just signed Derek Carr to a 4-year deal worth $150 million or whatever it is. There's ways and how much cap space did they have? Just a few. I think they were dead last in the NFL with like negative 50 something. So if the Saints can figure out ways to make this happen, not saying it's your preferred business model to constantly be operating in the negative, but look, the Broncos are going to be able to really have their cake and eat it too in free agency. As we've seen, like, how did the Chiefs afford this guy? We say that almost every year. How did they sign this guy? That's what the Broncos are going to be able to do. Hopefully they have the team success that comes along with, being able to attract those kinds of free agents. But, there's ways that you're able to work around. And another awesome just friend of the show, Cody, Kinley G.
Yes,
I love it. Just always shouting out the show and really being a great friend to you and I. So let's get to their thoughts, because, man, I think this is pretty much spot on with where you and I are at.
Yeah, and he says, I actually like these three, meaning, Justin, PJ, Caden Sterns, DTY, these combinations. These guys, says, I don't feel like we need to address safety, but on the other hand, either sign K-Jack back or find a low-price vet and free agency safety class. This draft isn't really good. You could use that pick on another position. And I think that, yeah, I mean, if you want to add like depth, developmental depth, you certainly can in the NFL draft. Do you do that when you only have 5 picks in the 2023 NFL draft? I personally, depends on who's available, right? And if there's a guy that's like, okay, hey, this guy is an athletic freak. He's a great fit for what we want to do defensively. He's a great insurance policy, because as we know, with injury histories, you always have to have an insurance policy. If you don't have one, then you're not covered, essentially. I agree with him. I think that you roll with what you have with these guys. We're kind of in the same process of thinking here, and I think now we just really open it up to everybody else in Broncos country. Do you agree? Do you think that the Broncos should roll with Justin Simmons, bring back Caden Sterns, PJ Locke, and roll with DTY as that fourth safety option? Between these 4 guys, you actually have a solid safety room. Some guys have a combination of experience, but also playmakers that could benefit the Broncos defense even further going forward. Make sure you drop your comment down below on YouTube if you're watching, or if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, make sure you tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new episode of the show where we throw the question out. Should the Broncos take a look at cornerback options in free agency? We'll tell you why they should. We also tell you why they shouldn't. And we'll also get the pulse of Broncos country on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.